The conference room reeked of burnt coffee and quarterly desperation. Blake Carver stood at the whiteboard like a corporate executioner, Patagonia vest straining, $200 marker in hand, declaring, "We need people who move quicker." Dust motes shimmered around him as if witnessing Wolf Industries' most expensive mistake in 40 years. I smiled, nodded, and started documenting. Blake had arrived 6 months earlier with buzzwords and a resume of imploded ventures, Rapid Pay, a fintech darling that blew through $67 million before collapsing after double-charging 50,000 coffees. Failure, to him, was experience. Our platform wasn't a toy app, it processed $847 million daily for 2.3 million users. Every protocol was stress-tested, every safeguard doubled. My fraud detection system alone saved $23 million last year. Blake's mantra? Ship fast, patch faster, apologize later. In banking, that's not innovation, it's malpractice, with the FBI on speed dial. His crusade against friction was about to spark congressional hearings. Blake wasted zero time assembling his dream team of yes people and junior developers who thought legacy code was a swear word and technical debt was something you could refinance. From my newly assigned desk, conveniently relocated next to the supply closet, because nothing says valued team member like proximity to office supplies, I watched him conduct what he called agile planning sessions. Translation: eliminating every safety measure I'd spent 3 years implementing while calling it optimization. The conference room buzzed with the energy of people who'd never had to explain to a federal regulator why a transaction had mysteriously vanished into the digital ether. Blake stood at his laptop, cycling through slides with titles like Velocity Optimization and Friction Reduction Strategies, each one more terrifying than the last. User authentication is too complex, Blake announced, gesturing at my carefully crafted security flowcharts like they personally offended his aesthetic sensibilities. Why do we need two-factor verification when we could have seamless one-click access? Our users want convenience, not cybersecurity theater. Because federal regulations, Blake. Because anti-money laundering laws that carry 5-year prison sentences. Because the last thing Wolf Industries needed was to explain to a congressional committee why grandma's pension got transferred to a cryptocurrency wallet in Moldova while she was buying groceries. Jake Hoffman, our newest junior developer and Blake's most enthusiastic disciple, nodded vigorously. Exactly. User friction is conversion poison. We should be reducing barriers, not creating them. I bit my tongue hard enough to taste copper. User friction. In banking software, where the users included everyone from tech-savvy millennials to 80-year-old retirees who still wrote checks for their utilities. Blake's next target was what he termed excessive documentation requirements. Our development process included comprehensive code reviews, security assessments, and impact analyses for every change, bureaucratic overhead, in Blake's estimation. We're spending more time documenting features than building them, he declared, pulling up metrics that showed our documentation to code ratio. Google doesn't document every search algorithm tweak. Facebook doesn't write impact assessments for newsfeed updates. The comparison was so absurd I almost laughed out loud. Google and Facebook weren't regulated financial institutions. They didn't handle people's mortgage payments or retirement funds. When Facebook's algorithm glitched, people saw cat videos instead of political rants. When banking software glitched, people lost their houses. But Blake was on a roll, eliminating review processes with the enthusiasm of someone decluttering a garage. Code review meetings, velocity killers. Security assessments, paranoid theater. Impact analyses, analysis paralysis in corporate form. Megan Torres from QA approached Blake's standing desk, because sitting was for the productivity challenged, with test results that looked like a medical examiner's preliminary findings. Megan had been with Wolf Industries for 7 years, had survived 3 major system upgrades, and possessed the kind of methodical attention to detail that made our platform legendary for stability. Her face carried that special expression reserved for delivering catastrophic news to people who won't listen, the look of a doctor explaining cancer to someone who insists it's just a cold. The simplified login system is failing authentication for valid users approximately 31% of the time, she reported, her voice steady as surgical steel. The error occurs most frequently with users who have special characters in their passwords or accounts created before 2019. Blake barely glanced up from his triple monitor setup, where he was simultaneously managing Slack conversations, reviewing sprint boards, and probably optimizing his LinkedIn engagement metrics. Launch anyway. We'll iterate based on user feedback. User feedback. On banking software. From customers who couldn't access their money to pay their mortgages. Megan's left eye twitched almost imperceptibly, a sign that would have sent our security team scrambling for backup protocols if they'd been paying attention. Blake, these aren't minor usability issues. We're talking about complete authentication failure for nearly a third of our user base. Edge cases, Blake declared with the confidence of someone who'd never received a call from a customer service representative explaining why 300,000 people couldn't access their paychecks on Friday afternoon. We'll patch post-launch based on real-world usage patterns. Real-world usage patterns. In an industry where real-world usage meant people trying to pay for groceries, rent, and medical bills. I took a very deliberate sip of my tea, Earl Grey, perfectly steeped for exactly 4 minutes, and said nothing. Sometimes the most powerful response is strategic silence, especially when you're watching someone dig their own professional grave with an efficiency that would impress a backhoe operator. Oliver Brennan from our cybersecurity team requested a meeting with Blake to discuss what his email diplomatically termed authentication protocol concerns. Oliver was a former NSA analyst who joined Wolf Industries specifically because we took security seriously enough to hire former government spooks. The meeting lasted exactly 18 minutes. I know because Oliver emerged from Blake's office looking like someone who'd just watched a demolition crew tear down a historic landmark with a wrecking ball made of good intentions and venture capital philosophy. He wants to eliminate multi-factor authentication entirely, Oliver confided during our impromptu coffee break conversation. Says it's friction that reduces user engagement metrics. I nearly choked on my perfectly temperature-controlled beverage. He wants to eliminate MFA? For a banking app? Gets better, Oliver continued, his voice dropping to the whisper reserved for discussing either classified information or impending corporate disasters. He's also pushing to reduce password complexity requirements because cognitive load impacts user experience. Cognitive load. In financial security. Because apparently, remembering a strong password was too much mental effort for people entrusting us with their life savings. The transaction module started exhibiting behavior that could only be described as creatively chaotic, like a jazz musician interpreting federal banking regulations. Transfers were being processed twice with random time delays, refunds were disappearing into digital limbo, and account balances were updating with all the accuracy of a magic 8-ball operated by someone wearing oven mitts. Thomas Chen, wait, Chen's on the forbidden list. Let's call him Thomas Liu, our senior backend engineer, had been monitoring the payment processing logs since 6 a.m., his screens filled with error messages that painted a picture of systematic failure. We've got duplicate transaction processing on approximately 12% of transfers, Thomas reported, his voice carrying the weary resignation of someone who'd seen this movie before and knew how it ended. The simplified processing pipeline is missing the deduplication checkpoints. Those deduplication checkpoints hadn't been simplified, they'd been eliminated entirely because Blake considered them unnecessary complexity that impacts transaction velocity. When Megan brought this to Blake's attention, along with preliminary damage estimates, he had a solution that would make a casino owner weep with envy. We'll round all discrepancies in the customer's favor. Good PR move, builds trust through generous error handling. Good PR move. For a company that processed nearly $1 billion daily. The mathematics of that generosity were going to hurt like a migraine in a fireworks factory. Blake, Megan said with the patience of someone explaining fire safety to a pyromaniac, we're not talking about rounding errors. We're talking about systematic double charging followed by systematic overcompensation. The liability exposure is exponential. Exponential is just another word for scalable impact, Blake replied, apparently having attended the school of corporate doublespeak with a minor in mathematical ignorance. The first wave of customer complaints hit our service desk like a tsunami of justified anger. Sandra Williams, our customer service manager and a 23-year veteran of dealing with financial software disasters, appeared at Blake's workstation with printouts that looked like casualty reports from a digital battlefield. We're receiving complaint calls at triple normal volume, Sandra reported, her voice maintaining professional composure despite what had to be mounting panic behind the scenes. Users are reporting double charges, missing transactions, and authentication lockouts that our standard reset procedures can't resolve. Blake glanced up from his laptop with the expression of someone who'd just been informed that water was wet. Growing pains. Every major platform update experiences initial user friction. User friction. That was Blake's explanation for everything, apparently. The digital equivalent of blaming the weather for a house fire. Blake, we're not talking about friction, Sandra continued with the persistence of someone who'd dealt with actual financial crises. We're talking about customers who can't access their accounts to pay rent. People whose paychecks are being held hostage by authentication errors. Small business owners whose transaction processing has become completely unpredictable. We'll scale customer service response accordingly, Blake declared, as if throwing more people at a systemic problem would somehow make the system less broken. At exactly 3:52 p.m., I received an email that made my afternoon considerably more interesting. Samantha Reed from Legal Compliance had scheduled an emergency regulatory review with Blake, and the subject line carried that special kind of corporate urgency usually reserved for SEC investigations and congressional subpoenas. Samantha was Wolf Industries' version of a forensic accountant crossed with a federal prosecutor, with the investigative instincts of a bloodhound and the personality of a tax auditor on espresso. She could spot a Dodd-Frank violation from orbit and had once identified a potential money laundering scheme by noticing an unusual pattern in transaction timestamps. The meeting was scheduled for 30 minutes. It lasted 12. Blake emerged from the conference room looking like he'd been interrogated by the SEC, FBI, IRS, and his own conscience simultaneously, then audited by all of them for good measure. His usual Silicon Valley swagger had been replaced by the haunted expression of someone who'd just discovered that disruptive innovation sometimes disrupts federal compliance requirements. Turns out, when you streamline banking software, you sometimes accidentally streamline away those pesky federal audit requirements. Those redundant transaction logs Blake had eliminated? The ones I'd insisted were unnecessarily complex data retention requirements? They weren't suggestions from a paranoid engineer. They were mandated by banking regulations that carried both criminal penalties and personal liability for executives who willfully ignored them. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act doesn't have a disruption exception. The Bank Secrecy Act doesn't include provisions for agile compliance methodologies. And the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation definitely doesn't offer innovation credits for creative interpretation of audit trail requirements. James Rodriguez, our chief legal counsel, and a man who'd successfully defended Wolf Industries through 2 regulatory investigations and a class action lawsuit, requested an immediate consultation with Blake. James was the kind of lawyer who prepared for trial while hoping for settlement, who read federal regulations like poetry, and who had memorized every banking compliance requirement implemented since the Great Depression. Their conversation lasted 47 minutes, and Blake emerged looking like he'd received a comprehensive education in the difference between innovative disruption and federal crimes that carry prison sentences. James, meanwhile, spent the rest of the evening updating his contact list for federal defense attorneys and researching the Wolf Industries directors' and officers' insurance policy coverage limits. Version 3.1 went live at dawn, because Blake believed in capturing that early bird user engagement window with all the strategic thinking of someone who'd never considered that banking customers might actually want their money to be available when they needed it. What he captured instead was the attention of every financial regulator within a 50-mile radius, plus several very unhappy congressional staffers who'd been monitoring Wolf Industries since our last compliance review. The deployment itself was a masterpiece of optimistic engineering. No rollback plan, no gradual release schedule, no kill switches. Just a full-scale launch of untested code into a production environment handling nearly $1 billion in daily transactions. By 7:23 a.m., our monitoring systems were painting a picture that would have made Dante reconsider the artistic merits of digital hell. Transaction failure rates spiked to 23%. Authentication success rates plummeted to 67%. And our fraud detection system, overwhelmed by the volume of anomalous activity, started flagging legitimate transactions as potential money laundering attempts. By 9:30 a.m., our customer service lines had transformed into a digital disaster hotline, with hold times approaching 45 minutes and call volumes that broke every record in Wolf Industries history. Users couldn't log in. Those who could access their accounts discovered transaction histories that resembled abstract expressionist art created by a mathematician having a nervous breakdown. The first call came from the office of the Comptroller of the Currency at 11:45 a.m. The second call, from the Federal Reserve Supervision Division, arrived at 12:07 p.m. By 2:30 p.m., we'd received inquiries from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, and what I can only assume was someone from the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Federal regulators don't typically call to congratulate banks on innovative user experiences. Amanda Foster, our CEO, spent the afternoon in closed-door conversations that probably involved phrases like immediate remediation, compliance assessment, and potential enforcement actions. Her assistant had been instructed to reschedule all meetings and cancel the weekend golf tournament. But the masterpiece of Blake's velocity-driven vision revealed itself mid-afternoon, when our security team discovered what they diplomatically called unintended access scenarios in the simplified authentication system. Translation: approximately 4,200 users could view each other's account information, transaction histories, personal details, and in some cases, social security numbers and home addresses. In banking, this isn't called disruption. It's called a federal crime with a side of class action lawsuit and a dessert course of congressional hearings. Oliver from cybersecurity appeared at my desk around 4:30, looking like someone who'd just discovered that their house was built on an active volcano. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "Somewhere private." The supply closet made for an interesting briefing room. "The authentication bypass isn't just allowing account access," Oliver explained in whispers that would have made CIA operatives proud. "It's exposing personally identifiable information for thousands of users. Names, addresses, social security numbers, employment information, transaction patterns, everything we're legally required to protect. The Privacy Act. The Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. The Fair Credit Reporting Act." Blake's streamlined system had managed to violate approximately 17 different federal privacy laws simultaneously. "How bad?" I asked, though I suspected I didn't want to know. "Worst case scenario? Criminal charges for willful privacy violations. Best case scenario? Only civil penalties that could reach 9 figures. 9 figures. With a potential B. Emergency weekend meetings at Wolf Industries were about as common as unicorns wearing business attire and considerably less pleasant. But when you've accidentally created what amounts to digital financial anarchy with a side of federal privacy violations, suddenly everyone discovers the joy of weekend overtime and emergency pizza delivery. From my home office, I monitored our internal communication channels as they erupted in increasingly frantic damage control efforts. Blake's velocity team was working around the clock in shifts, trying to patch holes in a system that was fundamentally compromised by design, like trying to fix a sinking ship with duct tape while still sailing through a hurricane. The Slack channels read like a real-time disaster movie script. "Authentication service down again. Third time today. Payment processing showing 347% normal error rates. Customer service reporting death threats from users who can't access their accounts. Legal wants immediate documentation of all system changes since Monday. Federal regulators scheduled site visit for Tuesday morning." The preliminary damage assessment made for sobering reading, like a financial autopsy performed while the patient was still technically alive. $3.7 million in processing errors, 73,000 affected customer accounts, potential regulatory fines reaching 8 figures, a legal team that was updating their resumes and researching federal defense attorneys, and a PR department that had started drafting apology letters in 17 different languages. Wolf Industries' board of directors held an emergency session via secure video conference, because nothing says corporate crisis management like trying to explain digital disasters through pixelated video feeds and choppy audio connections. I wasn't invited, of course, but the aftermath was visible throughout the building on Monday morning, executives walking with the careful precision of people who'd been comprehensively threatened with personal liability for corporate negligence. My phone rang with all the subtlety of a fire alarm during a library poetry reading. Blake's name flashed on the screen like a warning beacon, accompanied by the distinctive ringtone I'd assigned to people whose calls usually involved crisis management and overtime pay. "Irene," he began, and I could hear the desperation seeping through the digital connection like water through a cracked dam foundation. His voice carried the hollow quality of someone who'd spent the weekend discovering that consequences were more than theoretical concepts discussed in business school case studies. "I need you in the office first thing Monday morning. We have a critical situation that requires immediate attention." Critical situation. Like calling the Hindenburg disaster a minor aviation hiccup or describing the Titanic as experiencing temporary buoyancy challenges. "I'm afraid I can't help you there, Blake," I replied, settling deeper into my favorite armchair with a cup of perfectly brewed Earl Grey and a Sunday crossword puzzle. "You specifically stated that you needed people who move quicker. I wouldn't want to slow down your agile development process with my methodical, thorough approach to system architecture." The pause lasted long enough for me to complete 3 crossword clues, including a particularly challenging 7-letter word meaning poetic justice that started with N. Nemesis, perhaps. Look, I know we had our disagreements about development methodology, he finally managed, his voice carrying the desperate quality of someone who'd just realized that bridges, once burned, don't spontaneously reconstruct themselves. But you understand these systems better than anyone else on the team. You built most of the core architecture. Our disagreements. What a diplomatic way to describe systematic professional humiliation followed by public dismissal from projects I'd conceived, designed, and implemented. Blake, I said with the gentle patience usually reserved for explaining complex concepts to particularly slow children, when you removed me from product planning, you also eliminated my access to system documentation, code repositories, and architectural decision logs. Company policy is quite clear: no access privileges, no responsibility for system integrity. I could practically hear his brain processing this information like a computer trying to run modern software on Windows 95. Blake stormed into my workspace, the supply closet vicinity, like a man whose career was on fire and I was the only one holding a fire extinguisher, a bucket of water, and possibly a detailed evacuation plan. His usual Silicon Valley composure had been replaced by the disheveled appearance of someone who'd spent the weekend explaining to very serious people why federal banking regulations were innovation obstacles. His Patagonia vest looked rumpled, his designer glasses were slightly askew, and his hair bore the distinctive marks of repeated stress-induced self-styling. "Why is the app full of bugs?" he shouted, apparently having abandoned all pretense of executive composure in favor of raw panic mixed with desperate blame allocation. The entire floor went silent, not the comfortable quiet of focused concentration, but the profound stillness that occurs when everyone simultaneously realizes they're about to witness either a spectacular professional meltdown or a masterclass in workplace karma. Even the printer seemed to pause mid-job in anticipation of the show. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, fingers steepled in a pose I'd learned from watching too many legal dramas and courtroom movies. The morning sunlight streaming through the nearby windows created perfect dramatic lighting for what was about to become the most satisfying conversation of my professional career. "That's a fascinating question, Blake," I said, my voice dropping to the conversational tone reserved for explaining basic concepts to particularly dense toddlers or corporate executives who'd confused arrogance with competence. "Would you prefer the technical explanation, the regulatory compliance summary, or the executive briefing version? I need solutions. Now. The board meets in 90 minutes, and they want accountability, action plans, and immediate remediation strategies." This was it. 7 days of watching Blake's hubris crumble like a poorly constructed house of cards in a hurricane had led to this singular, perfect moment. Time to deploy the nuclear option I'd been carefully preserving like a fine wine waiting for the right occasion. "Here's your fundamental problem," I began, standing and straightening my blazer with theatrical precision that would have impressed a Broadway performer. "When you removed me from product planning and revoked my system access credentials, you also eliminated my ability to maintain, monitor, or repair the systems I designed. Company policy clearly states, no access rights, no responsibility for code quality, system integrity, or regulatory compliance." Blake's complexion cycled through several fascinating shades of corporate panic, from startup optimism pink to regulatory investigation pale to potential criminal liability gray. But the real issue, the fundamental, systemic, catastrophic issue, is that you systematically eliminated every quality control mechanism, safety protocol, and compliance checkpoint I'd built into our platform over 5 years of careful, methodical, thoroughly tested development. I paused, letting that information sink in like water into a foundation crack during a freeze-thaw cycle. "Those redundant processes you streamlined? They were redundant by design, Blake. Financial software requires multiple fail-safes, backup systems, and verification protocols because when you're handling other people's money, move fast and break things translates to commit federal crimes and destroy lives." Blake opened his mouth to interrupt, but I wasn't finished delivering his professional obituary with all the ceremonial dignity it deserved. "The authentication failures exist because you eliminated multi-layer verification protocols that were specifically designed to prevent unauthorized access while maintaining user experience. The payment processing chaos stems from removing reconciliation checkpoints that caught duplicate transactions, processing errors, and potential fraud attempts. The security breaches, and yes, Blake, exposing 4,200 users' personal information constitutes multiple federal privacy violations, happened because you decided that compliance requirements were user experience friction rather than legal mandates with criminal penalties. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the building's HVAC system cycling and someone's coffee maker gurgling 3 floors up. "Oh, and Blake?" I continued, my voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd just completed a particularly challenging puzzle. "That board meeting isn't about finding solutions or developing action plans. Samantha from compliance spent her weekend documenting every regulatory violation your velocity team introduced. The preliminary report is 37 pages long and includes sections on potential criminal liability, personal responsibility for executives, and estimated federal penalty calculations." I gathered my belongings with the unhurried precision of someone who'd just delivered a masterclass in professional vindication. "You want solutions? Here's the only solution that matters. Acknowledge that financial software engineering isn't a game where you can sacrifice safety for speed, admit that regulatory compliance exists for reasons more important than your velocity metrics, and start rebuilding every system you broke with the methodical, thorough, boring approach that actually works." Blake stood there looking like someone who'd just discovered that gravity was more than a theoretical concept and that professional consequences were remarkably similar to physics in their inevitability. The board meeting ran 4 hours and 11 minutes, longer than most films and far more dramatic. I know, because Blake left with a banker's box and the look of a man learning that careers fall with the same certainty as objects. His Patagonia vest was gone, replaced by a rumpled shirt. Swagger gave way to the careful shuffle of someone on black ice. CEO Amanda Foster, architect of Wolf Industries' rise and enforcer of zero regulatory tolerance, personally walked him to the elevators. Their exchange was brief, frigid, and final, the doors closing like a coffin lid on his tenure. As HR processed his remains, the wreckage of his week surfaced. The damage report read like a manual in financial malpractice: $3.7 million in transaction errors, 73,000 disrupted accounts, 31% login failures, 4,200 privacy breaches, 17 regulatory violations, a 400% spike in complaints with calls 28 times longer, $15.45 in fines, and over $100 million in potential lawsuits. My calendar chimed: strategic leadership discussion, A. Foster, CEO office. Amanda Foster's 34th floor office, sunlit and commanding, reflected authority earned by competence, not hierarchy. She wasted no time. "Irene, we owe you more than an apology," she said. "We owe you justice, recognition, and a significant promotion." Justice came as Blake's vacated product management role, higher pay, stock options, 45% raise, expanded authority over budgets and hiring, and resources to rebuild the QA systems Blake had wrecked. But the true vindication lay in Amanda's blunt clarity: "Your methodology may not dazzle investors, but it prevented us from explaining to regulators and 75,000 furious customers why their financial privacy was compromised." She glanced at the skyline. Blake was fast, yes, but speed without direction is chaos. Your approach builds systems that endure, comply, and protect. In financial services, that isn't preferable, it's survival.